welcome to the program today. My name is Julie Ahern. I've been an interpreter here in Yosemite since 1990, and I've been living in the park since 1988. And today's program is not about one of our larger warm fuzzy animals. Today's program, you can see these animals on the Muppets. They hibernate, they lay eggs, they kiss princesses. And if you're thinking Miss Piggy, or bats, or chickens, or the Prince and Snow White, you're wrong. But if your mind led you down the road to think of frogs and toads, then you're on the right mark. Now, some people's reaction to frogs and toads is pretty interesting. I'll say my program today is on frogs and toads, and I think people immediately revert back to 7th grade life science when you dissected and pinned all the parts to the tray, and maybe your memories of that aren't so fond. But my memories come from childhood memories. When I was a little girl and going out in wet, boggy places, or going out along lakes or streams or rivers and collecting tadpoles or collecting eggs, and then watching those things develop into living, growing frogs and toads. And even some of my most fondest memories out here in Yosemite are walking through this valley in the early springtime. And if you walk in the bike paths around dusk, you'll suddenly just hear this rising, romantic chorus of frogs start to build up until it becomes so loud you can't really even talk to anyone standing next to you. And so you may be saying, well, I think Julie, yep, she's fallen under the classic signs. She's got it bad, a passion for frogs and toads. And I do. And ever since a childhood thing, and it's gone on to my adult life. And what I want to share with you this afternoon is what I think are some really amazing stories about frogs and toads, but also what I think are some really disturbing things about frogs and toads. So when you think about a frog or a toad, we think about a group of animals. They're not reptiles, they're not insects, they're not mammals, they're not birds, they are what? Amphibians, which includes things like newts and salamanders and frogs and toads. So when you think about that word amphibian, what do you think it means to be an amphibian? What is an amphibian? You guys learned this in school. What's that? Land or water. Okay, anything else? They breathe air. Okay. And when he said land and water, that's real close because the root of that word is Greek, amphibious, and what it means is to have two lives. And think about that. When you see a baby frog, what does it look like? Kind of looks like a fish, right? Have you guys seen one? Okay. Do they have legs when they're really little? No, they have these little tiny eyes that are on the sides of their heads. They have a little pucker mouth, and that pucker mouth sucks algae and plants off of stems of other things underwater. They have gills like a fish, like you said. They have a tail. They don't have really legs. They're vegetarians. But as they grow older, they pop out these legs. Their eyes go from the sides of their heads, and they go woo, and they migrate to the top. They instead have gills, they turn into lungs, they breathe air. And instead of eating mainly vegetarian kind of foods, they get this long tongue that will come out and eat things like bugs. So they become a meat eater. So they really do have two lives, going from a tadpole then to a frog or a toad, an adult. And some people say, well, you know, those things are so simple. They haven't really come very far along in this whole idea of evolution. They haven't really gone very far since they've been on this planet. But really that's absolutely wrong. Because when we look at frogs and toads, we are looking back in the fossil record 240 million years. We find their records in fossils that long ago, which means they went through glacial periods, they went through temperature changes, they outlasted dinosaurs, they survived whatever hit the woolly mammoths, and we still find them today on this planet in some of the hottest places in the world, but also some of the coldest places in the world. So they must have something that enables them to survive not only all this time on the planet, but also these incredibly changing kinds of conditions. So we call that an adaptation, when you can survive, something that helps you survive. It can be either physical or it can be a behavior. So I want to give you some examples of some adaptations. And the one I'm going to pick out first is going to be an animal that we have in this park called the Yosemite toad. Has anybody here been to Tioga Pass? Not yet? Okay. It's a good place to go. You're at 4,000 feet now. If you go up another 6,000 feet, you'll be at Tioga Pass at 10,000 feet. So you can imagine how long summer is there. We say we have a fall, winter, spring, summer. fall, winter, spring, summer. Because summer up at that kind of altitude is very, very short. And so the Yosemite toad spends about 7 or 8 months of its life doing what? Hibernating. That's an adaptation and able to survive, because obviously a frog's not going to find a whole lot to eat when there's 10 feet of snow on the ground, right? So it goes down inside the burrows late in the fall, about this time when the weather gets cold. It goes down in the burrows of the squirrels or goes underneath the rocks, and it hibernates for about 8 months. But sometime in the spring, maybe it's a growing lights, maybe it's warmer temperatures, the male only wakes up. And he wakes up and he comes out, maybe there's been a little bit of melting snow around where his burrow is, and there's a little sun, and he creeps up because they're cold-blooded, right? So they creep up real slowly and they sit and bask in that warm sun. And they collect some of that sun. Now they feel like they can get moving, and they start to crawl across the snowdrift in front of them. What do you think they're looking for? Yeah, they crawl. The snow is cold, so they're up on their tippy toes. They don't want their bellies to touch that snowdrift. They crawl across the snow, and they'll find a little puddle of water at the edge of the snow, and they jump in. They start to swim around. Now, the water might be 38 degrees, but to that little toad, that feels pretty good. The sun's out, it's warm. 5 o'clock comes. Sun starts to sink in the sky. Air temperature gets colder. Water gets colder. Frog, toad gets colder, until what happens? He freezes. He freezes in that film of water on the surface of the pond or the little puddle. Stays like that all night long. In the morning the sun comes up. He starts to move again. This happens day after day. Now, why would a male of any species come out of a good sleep, crawl up through a burrow, sit in the sun, walk across snowfields, jump in ice-cold water to freeze every night? What drives them to do that? Mating. The thing that drives most living things on the planet is reproduction, the need to reproduce your species. And so the toad immediately, as soon as he hits that water, he starts to do what? To let the females know I'm awake. Starts to sing, right, to let them know, hey, in there, you're sleeping, I'm out here. So exactly, so they start to sing. So that's an incredible adaptation, to be able to come out and deal with that kind of cold temperatures. Another thing that has to do with reproduction and cold temperatures is what the bullfrogs do. Now, any of you seen a bullfrog? Big animal, about this big. I was riding my bike through here last spring on the bike path. It was dusk. The dark was setting in, and I look out on this puddle, and here are these two things about this big, the size of a Nerf football. And these things were coming at each other like this, swirling their hips, and then when they met, they bounced their chests, and then they bounced back. And then they'd do this again. Look like little sumo wrestlers, you know, bounce, come back. And I said, what in the world are those things out there? And I got off the bike, and I get down there, and I'm looking at those things, and I realized they are two male bullfrogs. I don't know that they were male, but I assumed that they were. But they were big and swollen, and during mating season, they have this adaptation of protecting their territory. And their adaptation is that their thumbs get really huge. Huge. And I'll tell you why, for two reasons. One is because when they see another male come in their territory, they swell up their bodies, and they swim towards that other male, and they either bounce him out of their territory with their chest, or they take those enlarged thumbs and they shove their heads underwater, and they hold them there. And the guy who can hold the other one underwater longer wins. The other reason to have enlarged thumbs is if a female swims into their territory, then he can take those large thumbs and hug her underneath her armpits and hold her. And when she releases her eggs, he can release the sperm, and he just fertilized her eggs. So it's a holding mechanism. Now, if you are an average-sized female bullfrog, you can produce about 15,000 eggs. They look like little jello blobs. But if you are a big female bullfrog, you can produce 25,000 eggs in this huge floating mass. Okay? Now, in my book, something that's been around for 240 million years can survive in two extreme locations, or many different kinds of locations, produces thousands of young, is well camouflaged. We'd think we'd see them all over the place, wouldn't you? But have you seen one since you've been here? Have you heard one? No. So why is that? Something might eat them. Well, this idea of why we don't see so many frogs and toads is one of the things that really is concerning us about this whole group of animals known as amphibians. And what we find out is that there has been a drastic decline in amphibians, not only here in Yosemite, but worldwide. And to give you an idea, I have a friend of mine who is a deceased ranger now. He was the oldest living ranger in the Park Service. His name was Carl Smith, and he worked for over 60 summers up in Tuolumne Meadows in the high country. And I figured this guy must have some great stories. I mean, he always had a great story, but I said, Carl, what do you remember about frogs and toads? And Carl sat out on his porch and he smoked his pipe, and he told me that some great stories, and one of them being when he was a young ranger, he would take little junior rangers out into the meadows. And as he would walk out in the meadow with these kids, they would see just frogs and toads leaping out of their way. And the kids would catch them and bring them up and show Carl, and they'd look at the different kinds of toads and the different kinds of frogs, and they would find lots. I've been to the same meadow that Carl talked about, and I've walked there in all different seasons of the year, and I've seen one toad, but I've never seen the hundreds that he recalls seeing just 20 or 30 years ago. Another friend of mine, Bob Roney, in the early 70s, he told me as a ranger he went up to Hardin Lake, which is again up about 7,000 feet in the high country. And if he went there in the right time in the spring to go swimming because the lake was really shallow, that he would not only see frogs and toads leap out of his way as he walked to the water, but when he got in the water to go swimming, sometimes he said it felt like he were swimming through tapioca pudding or jello because there were so many what there? Eggs in the water floating. I've gone there in the spring, the summer, and the fall, and I've seen one of our most common frogs, the Pacific tree frog there, but I have never seen eggs like that. I've never seen toads there at all, and that was 20 years ago. So maybe you're thinking, well, maybe that we're having a problem here in Yosemite, but if I go to Oregon, well, Cascade frog in Oregon is down by 20 to 40%. Well, you might be saying, what if I go outside this country? Maybe I'll find something else. Well, in some of the pristine places in the world, like the Monte Verde cloud rainforest in Costa Rica, there was this little tiny golden toad that they used to find there. And in the 60s, they could find 1,000 in one evening, count 1,000. By the end of the 80s, they found one male. Gastric brooding frog. Gastric means your stomach, brooding means to sit. Lives in Australia. They found it again in the early 70s. They watched this toad because it was the most amazing thing. They'd never seen it before. The male clasps the female. He fertilizes the eggs. She takes the fertilized eggs and she puts them in her mouth, and she swallows them. And she doesn't eat for 6 weeks, and she doesn't produce any acids in her stomach. And at the end of 6 weeks, what do you think happens? She regurgitates these little, fully formed gastric brooding frogs. Pretty amazing thing. They disappeared about 10 years later. So here it's happening on a worldwide basis. In 1989, a group of scientists got together that all study different kinds of amphibians and reptiles. And they were presenting papers on reproduction and on populations and this and that. But during their coffee breaks, they started talking. They said, hey, you're from China, right? She said, yeah. She goes, have you noticed anything in your populations of frogs there? And the woman said, yeah, I just noticed that there's been sort of overall decline. And you researcher from Australia, have you noticed some things too? And she said, yeah, my frogs in Australia are declining, and same thing in Africa, and in England, and in South America, and in the United States, and Canada. All over the world, they started realizing that frogs and toads were declining at a very rapid rate, which made everybody a little bit uneasy. Because it wasn't just a species here and a species there, it was like saying all the birds are disappearing, or all the mammals just are clearing off the world today. So this got some alarm. So what's your question? Question can you have forming in your mind right now? Why? Why are these things disappearing in some of the nicest places in the world, like Yosemite National Park? It's supposed to be clean air. Well, it's supposed to be clean streams. We're supposed to have a pristine environment. But in Yosemite, we face some problems that are being faced globally all over the world. Like, can we set a boundary for air quality? Can we say bad air from the Central Valley of California don't come into the park? No, because winds bring that bad air in here. And that bad air brings smog, and it brings acid rain. And 4.5 pH, the pH of water, can kill frog eggs. And we've had it as low as 3.9 in this park, which means acid rain could be a cause. We also have the sky above us, and we have a natural, if you're going to go outside and you don't want to get sunburned, what do you put on yourself? Yeah, you put some sunblock on there. Well, we have a natural invisible layer around the earth called the ozone. And the ozone keeps out a certain harmful ray of the sun called ultraviolet radiation. If you get too much ultraviolet radiation, you'll get skin cancer. And then you have to go through treatment. Well, in different parts of the world, like in Australia, they have big holes in that sunblock. and it's allowing this ultraviolet radiation to come through, and the kids there actually have to wear long sleeves and hats to school every day because they don't want to be exposed to that bad, harmful sun. Well, if your skin is really sensitive like a frog or toad's is that going to hurt you? It's going to be detrimental, not only to your skin as an adult, but as the little eggs that haven't even formed yet. How about overpopulation? Is the human species, the population of humans going up in the world? Skyrocketing, like 4th of July right now. Well, as we grow in numbers, what else do we need? We need air, we need places to live, we need food to eat, so we're converting wetlands into farms, we're converting wet areas into housing developments, and we're taking away the habitat of these animals. Not only animals, just frogs and toads, but all living creatures. So that's a problem we're facing globally. And then consumption. Anybody here eaten frogs before? Frog legs? Yeah, they're pretty tasty. They taste like chicken, right? Like everything else. Well, in some areas of the world, they actually export this item called frog legs, like in Bangladesh. They were getting paid by European countries who had run out of frog legs to export. Well, one of the things they noticed after they exported tons of frogs was that their amount of malaria cases started to rise. Malaria is a disease, and it's transferred by a mosquito. Why was the malaria rising?
Frogs are not eating.
Maybe it has a link to do with the amphibians eat those mosquitoes which carry that disease. So we see these connections happening that are maybe sort of subtle, but they're happening when we start having a species being lost off the planet. Regionally here in Yosemite, we also introduced those big bullfrogs. If you're this big, what are you going to eat? Everything that is smaller than you. And somebody thought it'd be a great joke to bring in bullfrogs in the valley. And those bullfrogs liked the valley, and they liked each other, so what did they do? They made more bullfrogs. Now those bullfrogs are taking over the habitat in the area of where these little frogs used to live, the native frogs. How many people like here to eat fish or fish? I do. Well, if you lived here in Yosemite 100 years ago, you could only fish here in the valley, and in any place that was lower than about 5,000 feet. If you went up to 10,000 feet to a lake, there would be no fish there, because they'd have to climb out of these walls of these valleys to get to where they could go up to those lakes and streams. So we've introduced trout all over this park. What do trout like to eat? Frogs, tadpoles, eggs. So we find that our toads and frogs might be declining because they're being eaten by an introduced animal. Drought. Where do frogs lay their eggs? Water. If we suddenly have a 2-year drought or a 7-year drought with less water, those ponds they like to grow up in are going to shrink, and there's no place else to live. There's lots of probably local causes and big global causes, and I wish I could tell you if it was one thing. If I could say, if we could solve the problem with bullfrogs, we would cure this problem and the frogs would increase. But that's not probably going to happen, and it's not the only thing. It's probably many factors, and we're not even sure yet. We're still doing lots of research. And some people say, well, Julie, you may be passionate about frogs and toads, but I still remember 7th grade, and I'm just not all that keen on them. And if they disappear, I really don't care. Well, there's 3 reasons I'm concerned if they were to disappear, and I'll end with those 3. One is, if you think of that cedar tree behind you, and you think of the manzanita tree behind that one, and you think of the raven that you've heard as it flies by, and you think of a cow and a whale and a mosquito and a Yosemite toad, it's all being one strand in a giant spider web, every living thing, including humans over here. And you start saying, well, we can do without spiders, and we can do without Yosemite toads, and we can do without cedar trees. What happens to your spider web when you start breaking apart that web? It kind of falls apart, doesn't it? And that's going to affect us too, because those linkages are important, and we're all tied to the trees, and we're tied to these different animals and plants around us. Second thing is, remember that old California history, mining history? What did the miners take in a cage down into the mines when they went down there? A canary. And what did that canary do? Yeah. Sometimes when these guys are underground in a big tunnel and it's dark and they're picking away at the rock or they're blasting the rock and they hit a poisonous pocket of gas that they can't smell and they can't see it, they may just all of a sudden drop dead. But if all of a sudden they have this little canary over here and it's and all of a sudden, okay, and it dies, what do the miners do? They get out of there. Take the canary out of the picture, and instead in that cage put a frog. same thing is happening. These frogs are literally croaking around us every day. And as they're dying, they're telling us there's something poisoning us. There's something that may eventually affect us humans. And we should pay attention to this, not just because of it might harm us, but it's harming things all around us. And lastly, if all the frogs and toads were to disappear in the world, then I wouldn't have anything to be passionate about, would I? And never again would I be able to walk in Yosemite Valley on a cool spring evening when the stars are out and the silhouettes of these mountains are all around me, the cold airs are setting, and I hear that romantic, building, beautiful symphony of frog voices no more. Thank you.